Chapter 30. Back at the camp, the hours passed slowly for Horace. Most of the time Halt lay still, but from time to time he would rouse himself to toss and turn, muttering a few words, none of which made much sense. Occasionally Horace would hear Will's name mentioned, and once his own, but most of the time Halt's mind seemed to be in a place a long way away and a long time ago. He mentioned names and places Horace had never heard before. Whenever Halt began these muttered outbursts, Horace would hurry to kneel beside him. He kept a supply of cloth soaking in a bowl of cool water, because he noticed that Halt's tossing and turning usually coincided with an increase in his temperature. It was never as dry and burning as it had been on the first day, but he was obviously uncomfortable, and Horace would mop his face and brow with the damp, cool cloths, crooning a wordless tune of comfort as he did so. It seemed to settle the ranger down, and after a few minutes of these ministrations he would fall into a deep, untroubled sleep once more. Infrequently he would wake and become lucid. Usually he knew who and where he was and what had happened to him. On these occasions Horace took the opportunity to coax him to eat a little. He made more of the beef broth, using some of their smoked jerked beef, soaking it and simmering it. It was quite tasty, and he hoped that it had some nourishment in it. Halt needed nourishment, he felt. He was looking weaker and weaker every time he awoke. His voice was no more than a thin croak. Once he was awake and conscious for more than an hour, and Horace's hopes soared. He used the time to get Halt to give him instructions on how to make the campfire bread. It was simple enough: flour, water, and salt, molded into a shape and then left burning under the embers for an hour or so. Unfortunately, by the time it was ready to eat, Halt had slipped away again. Horace disconsolately chewed the warm bread by himself. It was doughy and thick, but he told himself it was delicious. He cleaned his armor and sharpened his weapons. They were already razor sharp, but he knew that rust could quickly form if he didn't give them constant attention. And he practiced his weapons drills as well, working for several hours until his shirt was damp with perspiration. All the time his ears were alert for the slightest sound from the stricken ranger only a few meters away. He wondered where Will was, and how far he had gone. He looked at the map and tried to project Will's path and progress on it, but it was a vain attempt. There were too many uncertainties. Trails could be blocked or obliterated, fords could have deepened, or rivers could have flooded because of rain kilometers away. A dozen different things could force a traveler to make a detour in unknown country. Will had said he would be back in 3 days. That meant he planned to reach Massendaw and Grimsdale Wood, where Malcolm had his cottage, in just over 1 day. The return journey would take longer. Malcolm couldn't be expected to ride non-stop without adequate rest, as Will could do. Will had allowed 2 days solid traveling, with a full night's rest period in between. It would be tough on the elderly healer, but it would be manageable. Horace realized that his stock of firewood was getting low. At least replenishing it would give him something to do. He checked on Halt, watching the ranger sleep for several minutes before deciding that he wasn't about to stir. Then he took an axe and a canvas log carrier and headed for a small grove of trees 200 or 300 meters away. There were plenty of deadfalls there that would supply him with dry, ready-to-burn firewood. He gathered sufficient kindling and then looked for heavier pieces, cutting them into manageable lengths with quick blows of the axe. Every so often he would pause and turn and look back at the campsite. He could make out the figure lying near the smoldering fire. Chances were, of course, that if Halt were to cry out, he wouldn't hear him at this distance. It was hard enough to hear him from across the campfire. Satisfied that he had enough small pieces for cooking and a supply of heavier, longer-burning logs to last through the dark hours, he loaded the wood into the log carrier. With the axe over his shoulder and the log holder in the other hand, he trudged back to the camp. Halt was still sleeping, and so far as Horace could tell, he hadn't moved in the half-hour that the tall warrior had been absent. In the back of his mind, Horace had nursed a vain hope that he would return and find Halt wide awake and recovered, or at least on the road to recovery. The sight of the silent, unmoving shape filled him with sadness. Moodily, he sat on his haunches and fed a few of the smaller branches into the embers, fanning them so that tiny flames began to lick across from the coals and eventually caught onto the wood. The coffee pot was standing upside down where he'd left it, after throwing away the dregs from the last pot he'd made earlier in the day. He filled the coffee pot and set it to boil, and then selected their store of coffee from the ration pack. He hefted the little calico sack experimentally. It was nearly half empty, and he had no idea where they would be able to replenish it in this wilderness. "Better go easy," he said aloud. He'd taken to talking to himself since Will had left. After all, there was no one around to hear him. Can't have Will arriving back and no coffee to give him. When the water began to bubble and steam, he measured a little less than the usual amount into the palm of his hand and threw it carefully into the boiling water. Then he edged the pot away from the flames a little so that it settled down as the coffee began to steep. The delicious, unmistakable aroma rose from the pot, despite the tightly closed lid. Later, he wondered if it was that familiar smell that roused Halt. It certainly seemed so, judging by his first words. "I'll have a cup of that when it's ready." Horace swung around, startled by the sound of Halt's voice. Halt sounded stronger and more positive than he had the last time he had spoken. Horace moved closer to him, seizing his right hand. "Halt, you awake? How are you feeling?" Halt didn't answer immediately. He peered at the figure leaning over him and tried to raise his head a little, but then let it drop back, defeated. "Who's that?" he said. "Can't see too clearly for some reason. Must have taken a knock on the head, did I?" "It's me, Halt. And no, you were—" Before Horace could continue to explain what had happened, Halt began talking again, and the young warrior's heart sank as he realized that, despite the apparent strength in Halt's voice, he was even more far gone now than he had been before. "That Thorgan, wasn't it? Him with his club. I never saw him coming till he was on me." Horace actually recoiled a little in shock. Thorgan? He'd heard that name. He'd heard it when he was a little boy in the ward at Redmont. He was a famous tale of courage and loyalty throughout Araluen, and one that helped cement the remarkable legend of the Ranger Corps. Thorgan the Smasher had been an infamous brigand who had terrified the northeastern region of Araluen many years ago. His crew of cutthroats robbed and murdered travelers and even raided small villages, burning, robbing, and terrorizing wherever they went. Thorgan himself carried an immense war club, from which he derived his nickname. Halt and Crowley, having just revitalized and reformed the Ranger Corps, had vowed to stamp out Thorgan's band and to bring Thorgan before King Duncan's court of law. But in a running battle in a forest, Crowley had been ambushed by 3 of Thorgan's men and was fighting desperately for his life. Halt went to his aid, shooting 2 of the bandits and cutting the 3rd down with his sax knife. But in saving Crowley, he failed to see Thorgan concealed in the trees until it was almost too late. The huge bandit leapt out, swinging a terrible blow with the massive club. Halt just managed to evade its full force, slipping cat-like to one side at the very last moment. Still, it caught him a glancing blow on the head, and he only just managed to drive his sax knife deep into Thorgan's body before falling unconscious across Crowley. Even in that moment, he was trying to protect his friend. The 2 friends were found some hours later by a patrol of Duncan's cavalry. They were huddled together, both unconscious. Close by, the body of Thorgan was leaning against the bole of a tree, a surprised expression on his face and the hilt of Halt's sax knife protruding from his ribs. That was the event, from so long ago, that was now foremost in Halt's wandering mind. His next words confirmed Horace's suspicion. "Are you all right, Crowley? I thought I was too late getting to you, old friend. Hope you didn't think I'd let you down." Crowley, Horace realized, with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach, that Halt had mistaken him for the Ranger Commandant. There seemed to be no point in trying to convince him otherwise. Either he would realize his mistake or not. Horace squeezed his hand. "You'd never let me down, Halt. I know that." Halt smiled and closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them once more, and there was a strange calm in them. "Don't know if I'm going to make it this time, Crowley," he said, in a matter-of-fact voice. Horace felt his heart lurch with sadness, more at the tone of acceptance than with the words themselves. "You'll make it, Halt. Of course you'll make it. We need you. I need you." But Halt smiled again. a sad little smile that said he didn't believe the words he was hearing. "Been a long road, hasn't it? You've been a good friend." "Halt," Horace began, but Halt raised his hand to stop him. "No, might not have too long, Crowley. Got to say a few things." He paused, breathing deeply, gathering his strength. For a terrible moment, Horace thought he had drifted away. But then he rallied. "The boy, Crowley. Look after him, won't you?" Instinctively, Horace knew he was talking about Will. Halt's sense of time and events seemed hopelessly jumbled, hopelessly out of kilter. But he was searching Horace's face now, obviously seeing only a blur and waiting for a reply. "Crowley, you still there?" "I'm here, Halt," Horace said. He swallowed past a huge lump in his throat, desperately forcing the hot, stinging tears back as they threatened to force their way out through his eyes. "I'm here, and I'll watch out for him. Never fear." He felt a twinge of guilt at the deception, but deemed it was for the best. Halt had become troubled as he'd thought Crowley hadn't heard his request. He relaxed a little when Horace answered him. "Thought maybe you'd gone," Halt said. Then, with a trace of his sardonic grin, he added, "Thought maybe I'd gone." Then the grin faded as he remembered what he'd been saying. "He could be the greatest of us all, you know." Horace bowed his head, but he knew he had to answer. He had to keep Halt talking. If he was talking, he was alive. That was all Horace knew. "He had a great teacher, Halt," Horace said, his voice breaking. Halt waved a weary hand in dismissal. "Didn't need to teach him. Just needed to point the way." There was a long pause. Then he added, "Horace, too. Another good one there. Watch over him. He and Will together. They could be the future of this kingdom." This time Horace couldn't talk. He felt a numbing wave of sadness, but at the same time a glow of pride was in his heart. Pride that Halt would talk about him in such terms. Unable to speak, he squeezed the ranger's hand once more. Halt made another effort to raise his head and managed to get it a few centimeters off his pillow. "One more thing. Tell Pauline." He hesitated, and Horace was about to prompt him when he managed to continue. "Oh, never mind. She knows there's never been anyone else for me." That last effort seemed to exhaust him, and his eyes slowly closed. Horace opened his mouth to scream his grief, but he realized that the gray-bearded ranger's chest was still rising and falling. The movement was slow, but he was still breathing, still alive. And Horace bowed his head and wept, maybe from fear, maybe from anguish, maybe from relief that his friend continued to live, maybe from all three.